supposed to be 44 people here, but I bet there's traffic. So we're going to start on time, or relatively on time. My name is Walter Lim. I'm co-president of the board here at Chinese Historical Society of America. All of you. To all of you not been here, please stay a while, look upstairs. We have a wonderful exhibit on Bruce Lee. It's been here for a couple years. We'll be here for another couple. But another recently showcase exhibit on Chinese laundries and the history of Chinese laundries in San Francisco and around the area. So please feel free to stop by, take a look upstairs. We'd love for you to give us feedback, comments. This particular topic today is one which is on the newer side for us. We're very much history focused. And history for us means whatever happened yesterday and before. So, but the topic today covers the area that I think is increasingly important to us who live near or around Chinatowns, around urban developments that are impacted. And we have a wonderful author here who we'll introduce in a minute, who speaks to this topic very, very cogently. So I hope I've scanned the book, and I think it'll be a very, very interesting topic for all of us. I want to introduce Will's co-discussant, person who will converse first with Laureen after Laureen talks, Professor Professor at Sacramento State University Ethnic Studies Department. Dr. Gao is on our board, our most recent joint member of the board of CHSA, and very, very active in helping us put on programs like this. He is starting soon a Zoom series, which will be recorded for you to look at your leisure. It will have important topics about Chinese American experience. So I will let Will introduce our guest speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. So it's such a pleasure to be here to be in conversation in a few minutes with Laureen Hom. Laureen and I have been friends for over a decade now-ish, right? Something like that. She is currently, just recently, a new professor at San Jose State. So she just received a position there, moving up from Cal Poly Pomona, right? So currently she is now an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. She is the director of the Master of Public Administration program. She's an interdisciplinary scholar. Definitely I know her through her work through ethnic studies, but she does work in urban studies, work in public administration, work in public policy. I've had the pleasure to just finish the book. I've spoken with her about it again, but read it again for this talk, and it's a wonderful book. You're in for a great talk, and if you don't have the book yet, I definitely urge you all to go out and get it. Doesn't mention this on her bio, but she's also a fellow Lowell alum, so can't hide that. You should leave it down in the bio. Hoover 2, we both with the Hoover 2, look at that. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hom. Yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot to make a couple of quick introductions, and apologize. First, introduce Supervisor Rafael Mandelman, sitting here in the front. Supervisor Mandelman represents District 8 and is currently the president of the Board of Supervisors. He's available to us for a brief time, so I want to make sure to recognize him.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll say they're all brief for you. So I'm going to be brief. But I am Rafael Mandelman. I do represent District 8 on the Board of Supervisors and have for the last 7 years. But since January, I've been president of your Board of Supervisors. And so I get to spend a little bit more time outside District 8. Today we've had an amazing day walking around various events happening in Chinatown, including this one. And I really want to thank your president, Lynn, for your co-president of the board for stewarding this organization. I think especially when we have a national administration that is seemingly hell-bent on erasing so much of American history, that it's all the more important that in San Francisco and places that don't believe in that notion of what America is, that we actually double down and tell the real stories of how this country and this city came to be. So it's important work, and this is an amazing space. And I did finally get to see your Bruce Lee exhibit upstairs, which I know it's embarrassing. It's taken me 2 years, but it's wonderful. So thank you for your work and everyone on the board and on the staff. And then for these Lowell grads, thank you for joining the board. Thank you for doing good in the world. You're also doing good in the world, and we're just incredibly proud of you. And I can't actually stay for the whole talk, but I can hear a little bit of it, and I'm just excited. And also, like as an MPP myself, I love a director of an MBA program. So thank you for that too. And now I'll get out of the way.
Thanks everyone for being here today. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to share this book, share my book with you, and share all the stories and everything that I went through with the book. I do want to first express my gratitude to the Chinese Historical Society of America for having me here today. I want to thank Walter and Will for facilitating, Walter for the initial invite to be here at CHSA today. So for this part of the presentation, I am going to give you an overview of the book, some of the major themes, the why LA, kind of entice you to read the book if you haven't already. But what I wanted to do is, before I get into all of that, is to actually talk a little bit about my personal motivation and what led me to writing this book. As you can tell from the title, this book is about Los Angeles Chinatown, and how this one issue of gentrification is impacting the community. And you probably are really familiar with this term gentrification, right? Because this is happening in San Francisco as well as a bunch of other major cities across North America that have also these historic Chinatowns. As much as this book is about gentrification and urban development issues, though, it's very much a book that centers and critically analyzes the work of community leaders, their perspectives and their experiences being in LA Chinatown. And so these are the people who really care about the community. They usually have a connection to Los Angeles Chinatown or Chinatowns in general, right? And they were just kind of activated in some way to want to be a part of the community, to be engaged in the community, and to fight for the community too, right? To fight for its future. And this was somewhat my path too, as well. So as Will mentioned, we've known each other for over a decade. That's actually when I started the book too. We were both kind of graduate students in different universities. I was just moved to UC Irvine. That's where I attended the doctoral program in urban planning and public policy there. And I was, this research started in 2014, and I was just kind of in the process of trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do, right, for my dissertation research. Entered in the program, just sort of knowing, okay, it's urban planning, so obviously I'm going to do something around urban planning, but I really wanted to center the Asian American experience, mainly because Asian Americans are not included in a lot of these conversations around urban planning, public policy, and public administration too as well. So I knew that generally, and I also knew that I wanted to explore these issues around the Asian American experience and urban planning, but center what does it mean to do community-oriented work, right? Like to kind of unpack what does that look like, how does that kind of play out. And so I had these kind of broad ideas entering my program. During this time, which is again kind of the first few years of graduate school, both my grandmothers had actually also passed away. And both of them, and thus both sides of my family, had lived in this Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown. And full disclosure, my parents are in the back, so kind of like, okay, I have to make sure I do this story right. But my mom's side of the family in particular are pretty much kind of from Chinatown, right? My mom was born in the Chinese hospital here. Her and her siblings were raised in Chinatown. And when my dad's family immigrated from China, they settled in Chinatown. And my maternal grandmother in particular had lived in SF Chinatown her entire life after she immigrated to the United States. So this was very much her home here. And because of that, Chinatown, SF Chinatown in particular, was very much a place of familiarity for me, right? We, as you can see here, that's her home in Jackson Street. Some of you might be familiar with that street. We would celebrate holidays here and special occasions, Christmases, Lunar New Year, etc. But I also went there every Sunday. We would have our family lunches there, and we would kind of do our grocery shopping for the week. So again, really a formative place for me in my childhood. And so with her passing and my family's decision to actually not maintain or keep a house here, because we had not just all settled in different areas in San Francisco, but across California as well, I knew that my family's relationship, along with my relationship to Chinatown, was going to shift and become more distant. So I was sort of thinking through this as I was a doctoral student at UCI. And so I know we're talking about San Francisco quite a bit, and so you're probably wondering, well, why Los Angeles then? Was it just because it was the closest Chinatown to you because you were at UC Irvine? And that's like maybe slightly cynical of you, but there's some truth to that it was the closest Chinatown to me, as I was curious about Chinatowns. But in actuality, I was born in Los Angeles, and we moved up to San Francisco when I was 3 or 4 years old. I kind of have to, don't have the exact age, right? But, and so this was the very first Chinatown that I actually was exposed to. And even though we had moved up to San Francisco, we still frequently visited Los Angeles. We have family down there, do the typical things like go to Disneyland in the summer when we can. And we visited LA Chinatown during those trips. So as much as we had our go-to places in San Francisco Chinatown, we also had our go-to places in LA Chinatown too. And I also kind of personally have these vivid memories of doing all my back to school shopping in LA Chinatown because we visited during the summer. And so, and also, when I went to college at UCLA for my undergrad, I remember this is vivid. When my parents would visit, they wouldn't stay at UCLA on the west side. They stayed in Chinatown on the east side, in the Best Western. I don't know if you two remember that. And I always thought that was interesting, but now I realize it was because they appreciated Chinatown. It was a place that they were familiar with too, and also knew they were always going to visit there as well. So again, LA Chinatown was an important place for me as much as the SF Chinatown. And you know, I left California after undergrad, and so that relationship to LA Chinatown kind of shifted a bit. But since I was moving back to Southern California for graduate school, you know, I was really curious very much about what was going on in Los Angeles, in the LA Chinatown during this time. So that's sort of kind of personal motivation, the kind of was what brought me specifically to urban Chinatowns, and specifically Los Angeles Chinatown. So as much as there was this kind of broad idea that I had, these kind of intellectual motivations, I just kind of want to point out that if it wasn't for kind of my personal background and my family history, I probably wouldn't have had that specific path to want to really explore what is going on in Los Angeles Chinatown. So, so enough about my background, which I'm also happy to kind of talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A. I want to talk more, spend the rest of the presentation talking more broadly about the book. And I'll start off talking about kind of more the larger framework and arguments about the book. So this book is very much about Asian American communities and politics. So as Walter mentioned, I'm not an official historian, neither an academic or community historian, but very much appreciate that how much history matters in understanding communities and politics. But this book, given that it looks at Asian American communities and politics, it emphasizes in particular that places are important for us to understand how communities form and how places develop, or how politics develop, because places provide individuals this kind of physical and social environment for how we experience the world. So the physical conditions of a place and the interactions that we have within different sites in a place, like businesses, parks, homes, etc., they all shape our identities, right? Our individual identities, our community identities. And with that, it shapes our sense of self, right? And our sense of belonging to each other. And even our physical and mental health too, right? So from an urban planning perspective, the processes and policies and practices that we do that folks do as planners and as policymakers to change places are actually quite critical for us to understand how communities form and shift, as well as for us to understand the kind of larger context of how broader social inequities also form, persist, and change, and hopefully can actually be rectified through making better policies in the future. So for me and the book, it's just very critical to have what I call this kind of spatial perspective to the Chinese and Asian American experience, right? That place really matters. And Chinatowns, as you can see here, are just really rich sites for us to understand this, right? So we know that Chinatowns formed due to racial segregation, but we also recognize Chinatowns as sites of that legacy of racism, but also community resilience too, which is why they've persisted for so long, not just in LA, but across other cities in North America. But it's also more than just a historical space. It continues to be this contemporary space of community building. And for me, the way I situate it in the book, I see Chinatown serving as this important site for Chinese and Asian Americans to gain a political consciousness too, right? To be politicized at a very kind of local grassroots level. So Chinatown is not just this important community and cultural gathering space, which I think we tend to kind of see Chinatown for the most part. It's very much an important space for us to assert our politics and also to kind of form our kind of like political identities. So Chinatown for me is as an urban planner, is very much this physical neighborhood, but an important and contested political space for Chinese and Asian Americans. And so, given that, urban Chinatowns continue to be this important site for Chinese and Asian American community and political building, they are also very much these contested sites of gentrification too. And so these are just a few headlines and kind of op-eds and issues that were raised about what was happening in LA Chinatown, that the different changes that were going on, that many saw as this is gentrification. And this was during the 2010s when I did the bulk of my research. And so if you think about it, right, that this is what's happening in Chinatown, right? These kind of tensions of gentrification that is happening. It shouldn't be surprising that the people who are getting politically engaged and the politicization that's happening in Chinatown is interwoven with this issue of gentrification, that people kind of have to address it, whether it's intentional or not, right? Because it's just part of the larger context that is happening in Chinatown. And so, I do spend some time defining gentrification in the book because, again, that's kind of the major topic. And I do this because it's a term that I think is used quite a bit. It's used a lot, especially in kind of public discourses. And I think because of that, it's also just confusing in a lot of ways because people tend to even associate it with like, oh, there's a change happening in the neighborhood that I'm not too comfortable with. It must be gentrification, right? And that is makes it kind of just a meaningless term in some ways. So for me, though, I wanted to make sure that I had a pretty clear definition to situate and orient the readers of the book. And so for the most part, my definition is, I think what I would say has become a pretty standard definition as of late of gentrification, which emphasizes how we see these changes that are contributing to an upscaling of the neighborhood, right? These kind of higher socioeconomic status, this kind of upscale boutiques and businesses and things like that. But it's not just that, it's a forced displacement. That is what we're seeing with gentrification. Forced displacement of long-term residents, community institutions, and business owners. So what this means is the changes that we're seeing, right, are not actually providing opportunities for the current community to improve their livelihoods. And instead, what we're seeing with these changes is that they're targeting relatively affluent outsiders to the community who then change the neighborhood to suit their needs and interests, not thinking about the current long-term residents and stakeholders. But, so this is, again, I think most people kind of think of gentrification now, but in my book, I slightly differ because I also address that forced displacement can take a lot of different forms. So traditionally, we tend to think of gentrification as this kind of primary direct forced displacement, right? That there is this old building and there's folks who live and work in that building. And then a new development is proposed and they demolish that old building, forcibly, physically displacing folks in the process. That happens, but what we're seeing actually more frequently, I would argue, is more what we call kind of this indirect displacement, right? So we're seeing maybe a new development or change coming into maybe what is a vacant lot or a vacant storefront. And so it's not actually directly displacing anyone because it's what some people would say it's not being used or it's underutilized, quote unquote, right? But what it does, their presence, because depending on who they're targeting, right? It can create these ripple effects that over time will lead to the neighborhood becoming more unaffordable for, again, the long-term residents and business owners or tenants. The other aspect is that it can lead to what is more this kind of symbolic displacement, this psychological displacement too. I think this is really critical for Chinatown, that you have these changes that are happening, again, not physically displacing anyone, but because it changes kind of the feel of the neighborhood, the cultural character of the neighborhood, it can cause a feeling of exclusion among current residents that they're seeing that this is no longer their home and that their histories are being erased as well too. So given this kind of larger, again, context of gentrification that's happening in the neighborhood, the book, again, primarily focuses on community leaders and how they're responding to it. So I'm really examining this concept of community control and power, right? How that is asserted and the implications of that towards equitable development, which is the goal of spatial justice, and that's the title of the book. So this idea, this concept and goal of equitable development, though, is not really easy, especially in Chinatown, because it just has so many different purposes and meanings for different folks. So, as mentioned previously, we can think of it as a symbolic place of heritage and community gathering space for Chinese and Asian Americans who don't necessarily live in the neighborhood, but it's also very much has been a home for working class immigrants to live, work, and receive social services. And then we can think of also just other external stakeholders like the city, right? It's developers, it's a site to support and assert this kind of multicultural, kind of global identity for the city too as well. Chinatown plays an important role in that. So these different values and purposes and identities of Chinatown may shape how we engage in community development and planning for the future of Chinatowns. So the book is kind of asking this broad question, but it's asking also these very fundamental questions about how spatial justice unfolds in LA Chinatown, but urban Chinatowns more generally. So this question of who has the right to Chinatown, and specifically who has the right to speak on behalf of Chinatown's past, present, and future. And then given that, what are the implications of the political representation and engagement in Chinatown for the people who are living and working there currently? There's a seat here too, if anyone wants a seat. Feel free to come on over. Getting into some of the chapters of the book, I'm again not a historian. I'm very self-conscious about that, being at CHSA here, but I do show and argue that the history of LA Chinatown, that LA Chinatown and through its history, it's an especially important space for us to understand these larger tensions about spatial justice, urban development, and gentrification, and even implications for other urban Chinatowns. So the neighborhood history specific to LA reinforces how all Chinatowns have always been subject to these external forces that have created the threats and actualities of forced displacement. And each place though, right, each city just plays out just a little differently because of the specific kind of local context. So for LA, I'm going to argue it started with the Chinese massacre of 1871. Which urban planners and for historians, we definitely recognize it. For urban planners and policymakers, they don't always see this as a typical forced displacement. But I argue that it actually should be considered because this racial violence and mass lynching that happened in old Chinatown was extremely disruptive, to put it lightly, to the sense of safety, home, and community in LA Chinatown. So that is the kind of the first forced displacement that happens, and happened within just a few years of the establishment of old Chinatown. What planners and policymakers do officially acknowledge is the official demolishment of old Chinatown for Union Station, which started in the 1910s and culminated in 1930. And this was, again, part of, really summing it up, but part of the city's larger efforts to kind of build up their civic center area, which Chinatown neighbored, and also to increase tourism to the neighborhood. New Chinatown, which is the site of the current historic Chinatown in LA and the neighborhood that I focus on, was a resettlement plan led by Chinese American business leaders, and this was established in 1938. So 85, 86 years old too, so less than a century old, but that specific Chinatown. So even though it was resettled, the threats of displacement actually continued in the post-World War II era. So there are kind of multiple factors. One is that the city did continue to develop the downtown area, the civic center area, specifically freeways too as well. So those of you who might be familiar with LA Chinatown know that's kind of this intersections of freeways that kind of surround the neighborhood. But also racial segregation was being outlawed, right? And the social standing of Chinese Americans was also shifting. So before, as they were aliens ineligible for citizenship and very much faced this kind of legal, racial exclusion and social exclusion, but now they were shifting to this kind of tenuous position of the model minority too. And this tenuously, and I put a big emphasis on tenuous, but this tenuously allowed for Chinese Americans to also live outside of Chinatown too, right? There's still kind of a pattern of kind of what we call de facto segregation happening too. They could really still only live in certain areas across LA. But again, what this meant was that people thought Chinatown was going to disappear because of these kind of different forces that were contributing to these changes. However, there are also changes to immigration policies, and that actually led to population growth in Chinatown, also changed the character of Chinatown. We know it originally is kind of bachelor society is more kind of, now is becoming more of an immigrant family community as well as senior citizens. And so all of that, these kind of shifts also solidified it as this kind of working class Asian immigrant neighborhood, which also kind of shaped the work of the community activists starting in the 1970s who were coming into the neighborhood, and they were really trying to kind of improve the conditions of Chinatown. And this all sets this kind of larger context of what I saw in the 2000s and the 2010s when I did my research, with these kind of deep concerns about the market rate housing coming into the neighborhood, as you can see here, these kind of restaurants, and I say hipster restaurants coming in as well, and people being really concerned this is causing displacement. And so, you know, part of this chapter that I include about the history is that I kind of want to argue that what we're seeing today is not necessarily brand new, but instead part of this kind of larger historical thread of how Chinatown, again, began as this racially segregated space, and it also just continues to be this marginalized space that's vulnerable for displacement in the urban landscape. And I think this is something that I believe unites all urban Chinatowns across North America, that we have these external threats that displace and disrupt the community, but there's always resilience of the community and a community response to these threats as well. So I kind of mentioned that, again, this is something that unites all Chinatowns, and again, the LA Chinatown history kind of reinforces that. There is something that I want to point out that I think LA Chinatown does serve as a unique site for other urban Chinatowns to learn from, and I think this is where I'm gonna do a plug, not just for my book, but for an upcoming edited volume that's coming out that Will is editing, I'm contributing to, that's about the multiple Chinatowns that coexisted in LA. And so I like to say, oh, LA is unique in that regard. I think we're unique in that we recognize that these different Chinese American settlements have been coexisting with each other since the early 1900s. So it's just a very kind of plain map, but you can kind of see all the different Chinese American settlements throughout time. I go into a little bit more of the historical context of this. But the old Chinatown, the original old Chinatown before it was demolished, actually coexisted with this area called City Market. When the current Chinatown, again, which is a resettlement of the old Chinatown businesses, it also coexisted with other smaller Chinese American pockets in the southern and eastern area of the city. This includes East Adams down there and what is present day Silver Lake and Apple Park. And I would say the folks that I interviewed that, I hate putting people in these kind of generational categories, but I'll say baby boomers. Baby boomers that I interviewed, they talked about that they lived in they grew up in East Adams, they grew up in Silver Lake and Echo Park, and they didn't live in Chinatown, but they frequently visited Chinatown and had ties to it. So I like to point this out because one, this predates how all of what we're kind of seeing right now with San Gabriel Valley and these kind of suburban settlements kind of overshadowing Chinatown. So I point this out because this is a major tension that people often talk about with planning for Chinatown and its future. That Chinese Americans were geographically dispersed and we formed communities outside of urban Chinatowns. And so this is really reshaping the attachments and relationships that we have to the older Chinatown, right? And some would argue that we have a detachment, right? Because we have zero or limited relationship. But the LA context and history shows that it's actually possible for different Chinese American settlements, if you want to call them Chinatowns or not, but definitely Chinese American settlements to coexist with each other. Even if it may be kind of precarious at times, might be competitive, but there's always sort of a relationship between these spaces. And for me and for my work, what this shows that is there is always a precedent for Chinese Americans, even if they did not live in Chinatown, to still be involved in the development of the neighborhood. And again, it's just this larger question of what are the repercussions of their involvement to the actual community kind of living and working in Chinatown. So, and I'm not a historian, but I wanted to kind of point out these kind of larger kind of historic motifs and kind of themes that kind of set the context for what is the bulk of the book, which, again, this is just a quick, and I'm going to go over these, summarize each of these chapters in just a bit, but again, each chapter in the book really is dedicated to a theme about how community power is asserted, and then kind of linking that back to why gentrification is this contentious issue. And contentious issues specifically within the community. So again, there's, we tend to think of gentrification, urban development conflicts as the community versus outsiders, whether they're the city or outside developers, right? Which I do address in the book, but the book really focused on how is the community itself, right, among themselves, trying to kind of negotiate this issue, work with each other, not work with each other, and some of the tensions around that. And what I write in the book is driven by my time in the neighborhood. Again, and around majority of it was from 2014 to 2018, doing observations, hanging out with folks. But it's really driven by the interviews I did with over 50 community leaders in LA Chinatown, representing these kind of different interests and generations of leadership in Chinatown since the 1970s. So, so I'm going to give the snapshot of those kind of four major chapters. So the first chapter after the history is about the development and evolution of the local community groups and in Chinatown, in LA Chinatown, and how that actually has complicated how we define who is a Chinatown stakeholder. This was very much a critical chapter, as much as providing this general history of the neighborhood and specifically a planning history of the neighborhood, because these organizations anchored Chinatown as this important, political center, an ongoing, evolving political center for Chinese Americans and more broadly Asian Americans too. And again, that's the kind of the crux of my book. And so, the organizational landscape, this is just a few of the groups. The organizational landscape is really complex with different interest groups representing, business interests, housing, social services, the different family and regional associations. Again, just really vast in terms of their mission and their purpose. Some are over a century old, like you think of our CCBAs, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations, and others are less than a decade old too as well. And they also vary in their formality too as well. So many are legal, like the legal nonprofit status, the 501Cs. However, there are also just groups that are loose collectives, where just individuals just come together because they're interested in working on an issue together as well too. And so because of this kind of variation and vastness in the organizational landscape, and this landscape also, the organizations also allow people who are not residents, right, to be involved in Chinatown. There were a lot of questions about how the organizations and their leaders and their members serve as representatives of the neighborhood. And so I saw community leaders really kind of trying to assess each other's claims to the neighborhood. They were often trying to legitimize that they had this kind of right to speak on behalf of Chinatown, oftentimes based on some type of material relationship to the neighborhood. So saying, I'm a property owner, I'm a resident, and that actually was uplifted the most. The folks who were residents and became outspoken community leaders were often seen as kind of authority figures on what was happening in Chinatown. And they kind of used this also to leverage not just their status in the neighborhood or their claims, but they also did it to kind of delegitimize others as well too. And for me though, what I kind of show in this chapter is that what it highlighted actually was, it wasn't enough to just say, hey, I'm Chinese American, or had family ties to the neighborhood, like my grandmother lived there, or I did my shopping there, like all the things that I said in the beginning of this presentation. That didn't fly with a lot of folks when I went into the community. It was more about the physical and time commitment that you spent in the neighborhood. And probably most importantly, that you were trying to build relationships with residents and workers. And so there were further distinctions, as you can kind of see with this quote here from a member of the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development and a former member of the Chinese Progressive Association. They were kind of also building these further distinctions where they were kind of emphasizing that serving the community didn't mean that you just spoke for them. It was actually about how did you try to build this equal partnership with the community too in your work. So this kind of concept of self-determination was very ingrained in some of their arguments. So the goal was really just to work together with residents, workers, and business owners to kind of build this larger community capacity so that the folks in the community could actually directly advocate for their rights too. And so that was part of their way of also kind of negotiating their presence in the community and also guiding a lot of their community work. The next chapter continues to examine political representation, but specifically focuses on how the city tried to institutionalize community input. And so I specifically analyzed these kind of three groups or spaces. Two of them were these advisory groups, these community advisory committees, this neighborhood council, and they both have this kind of similar purpose to try to bring together these different stakeholders in Chinatown, again, representing different interest groups from business owners, property owners, residents, nonprofits, etc. And for them to deliberate with one another, come to consensus, and then advise on development issues to city council and to other city agencies as well too. The other group that I profile or entity that I profile in this chapter is the Business Improvement District, which is different from the other group because it wasn't a space that was supposed to represent all these different stakeholders coming together. It actually was managed by a local nonprofit that primarily represented commercial property owners, but they also were a form of local of the city trying to promote local community control over public resources, as this group managed public funds with the goal to improve economic development. And so in this chapter, I show how these new spaces kind of changed the neighborhood's governance and political dynamics, because prior to that, for the most part, Chinatown's governance was really kind of informally structured through those organizations that I profiled in the previous chapter, right? They're kind of work that they do individually as well as kind of relationships with each other. So now the city has these structures where they kind of get the formal input from the community. And at one point, this actually seemed quite beneficial because it led to this new generation of community leadership that helped to advocate for affordable housing. However, ultimately, these spaces over time contribute to heightened internal conflict in the neighborhood. What many described over and over again as this housing versus business interests in Chinatown that kind of perpetuated and still is present today. What I show and I go into detail about all the dynamics that happen here is that I just ultimately argue that these spaces were again created by the city and sort of placed upon Chinatown were really limited in providing this kind of holistic representation of the community despite its intent, right? These spaces ended up being kind of dominated by just a few individuals, if not just kind of one individual who then had kind of the most political influence in the city and representing Chinatown. And it didn't really promote this kind of democratic governance in the neighborhood where the most historically marginalized within Chinatown were suddenly having a new space to assert their voices. That wasn't happening. And as this quote down here shows, and it's from Munson Kwok, some of you might know him because he also has ties here to SF Chinatown, and he's a prominent community leader down in LA. There just wasn't a space for people to really engage in what we call a healthy conflict, where you do have these kind of different perspectives coming together, but that in the end you can kind of respect that and still come together and come to consensus and speak on behalf of Chinatown. And so trying to find this forum, this group that, again, the city could not provide was something that I saw the community trying to actively create. And they were kind of in the process of creating one during my research. And I think they're still kind of in search of a place, of a forum like this to this very day. So in addition to political groups and spaces, I also dedicate a chapter about language and how language is a way to express control and power. So people knew I was researching gentrification, I fully disclosed that. And I noticed people didn't like talking about it. As I was trying, and I would ask during interviews, and even when it would just be brought up casually during meetings, is people had kind of very strong reactions to the term. And as I was trying to figure out why people were shying away from using the term, and also why there were actually very different conflicting definitions, I found this other pattern emerging in the way that people talked. There's this narrative emerging among community leaders of wanting diversity and balance for Chinatown. And this cut across everyone, age, generation, whether they were speaking on behalf of commercial property owners, residents, business owners, etc., right? And I think this is most likely due to not just gentrification being a confusing term, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, but that actually everyone also earnestly wanted change for the neighborhood. They knew that by saying sometimes gentrification, it was sometimes equated with no change or not wanting any change. So they wanted to kind of shift the language a bit and say, hey, we do actually think that there should be change in the neighborhood, and that the current conditions were not necessarily, like we could do better, basically. However, this didn't mean that they agreed about what the change should highlight. So as I was going through all of these narratives, when diversity and balance was mentioned, And there was a lot of this being mentioned. I saw that people were using these kind of different reference points to define how that balance should be achieved or what to diversify from. And because of that, they were ultimately centering specific segments of the Chinatown community and specific stakeholders in the process. So for example, this kind of quote all the way down there on the slide is from a tenant organizer, and we noted that there was an imbalance of current affordable housing. And the reference point they were using, as they explained it, was based on the current trends that they saw happening across the city. And because of that, they argued low-income residents were being ignored, not just in Chinatown, but across Los Angeles in general. However, in this other quote here, which represents kind of a younger business leader, they use the word balance too, as well. And they use the word balance to actually critique the history of affordable housing in Los Angeles Chinatown through the 1980s and up until 2010. And they were kind of justifying that there was a lot. If you look at the numbers purely without kind of, depending on how you interpret it, you could argue there was a lot of affordable housing development being built and not a lot of market rate. So they were using that as their reference point to say, to justify their support for some of the market rate housing in the neighborhood, saying that you need to balance this history out, this history of development. And this would bring to them a diversity of residents and consumers to the neighborhood. And you can see this also, this ultimately probably centered kind of more of the business and property owner interest than maybe the long-term tenants. And so, with this chapter, what I hope it kind of highlights is that, the way we use language, we might kind of use the same terms, right? But there's more, if you kind of dig deeper, and you can kind of see that maybe we're not actually speaking the same language per se, even though we're kind of using these same words of balance and diversity. And so the last chapter is probably my densest chapter, but it examines the importance of neighborhood culture, and specifically how a Chinese American culture is being regulated and expressed through the neighborhood design and uses of the neighborhood. And so through this, I kind of unpack this kind of tension of, as you can see here, legacy and modernity. So what does it mean to preserve Chinatown, but also how to evolve it too, because community leaders recognize very much so it's a space of heritage, right, and history. But they also felt in order to sustain it, they needed to evolve it as this contemporary Asian American space, however that is defined. And as I mentioned, this was a really dense chapter because Chinatown is this cultural neighborhood and many things define what culture is. And so I have quite a few examples of that, so such like the architectural design of the buildings, the events and festivals, as well as what I'll kind of give as an example here, the small businesses in Chinatown. And I really highlight the small businesses in this chapter specifically because the immigrant-owned small businesses in Chinatown don't just serve this economic purpose, right? They've also come to represent a community history. They are also spaces, like community gathering spaces as well too. And so many of these businesses that we kind of value and having this kind of longer history and sentiment and importance for the community are what we call kind of legacy businesses in Chinatown. And I think here in San Francisco, we also kind of use that term. It's something I think cuts across all the Chinatowns. In LA Chinatown, we kind of informally recognize there's multiple generations of legacy businesses too. So roughly in half, you can think of some of these older businesses like Phoenix Bakery, which represents kind of the older history, Chinese American community history, but also we're starting to recognize the more quote-unquote contemporary history, the post-1965 context and the immigration to Chinatown, which are represented by the swap meets and some of the other stores there. And again, these are the places that I also went to as a youth. And so, and actually still as an adult, as these older businesses slowly closed, Phoenix Bakery is still around. Some of them voluntarily have left due to generational turnover. Some are being forcibly displaced. Actually, the swap meets are in that process right now because of changes in property ownership. Given this kind of business turnover, we are seeing relatively affluent businesses coming in. and even some corporate and chains coming in, a corporate store owned and chain stores coming into the neighborhood. So a few slides ago, you probably saw there was a Starbucks in the neighborhood too, right? So these businesses, especially the restaurants, which I'm highlighting here, really are the center of the public discourses about gentrification in Chinatown, in LA Chinatown specifically. However, many of these restaurants and businesses are actually owned by young Asian Americans. And they vary in terms of the services, products, or cuisine that they provide. So you can see this example here. La Cita is owned by Filipino American brothers, and it serves kind of contemporary Filipino cuisine. So not Chinese American, but kind of staying Asian American, right? But then this other restaurant here, Amboy, owned by a Filipino American restaurateur, but serves hamburgers too, right? So we're trying to really kind of make sense of their presence. And I know this is happening in other Chinatowns as well too, because these business owners are continuing this kind of longer legacy of Chinatowns being built through Asian American entrepreneurship and small businesses too, because these are for also small businesses. But their presence, again, raises these questions that were the fundamental questions that I posed in the book, right? So who benefits from this other than the business owners, these young Asian Americans, right? How does this impact the long-term residents? Does it serve them? Going back to that kind of question about diversity and balance, can these businesses kind of coexist with the long-term businesses and kind of help bring kind of this mix of consumers? And also that other question, right, is being kind of Asian American enough to say that you have this right to be in Chinatown and not be critiqued as well too. So these larger questions about their presence bring up these kind of larger questions that again kind of drive the questions I'm trying to answer and sort through in the book. So to wrap up, you probably have noticed my book highlights a lot of conflict in the community. And again, I think it has to do with the context that I'm working in is gentrification, and it's an ugly issue, right? And so it very much doesn't romanticize the community. I think it paints a pretty much kind of reality of how we construct community, that we get along, but there's also times of conflict too, right? And this is how we kind of build and reconstruct community and progress forward. And I will say that most people I spoke to, as much as this is my, my work and my interpretation of all the interviews and observations that I did in the neighborhood, most people I spoke to were just very open with me about the good, the bad, and the ugly that was happening in the community. And very much also saying, this is my perspective, and when you go talk to someone else, they're gonna have another perspective as well too. So I feel very flattered that they felt like I could do right to the community and bring these kind of different perspectives together. And I appreciated that both kind of intellectually as a student at the time, now as a professor, which is so weird to me, but also personally, as you saw, I was sort of grappling with like all these questions about my relationship to Chinatown too. I don't like to end negatively though, even though the book again is a lot about kind of conflict and how we kind of sort through that. I always, and the last chapter also ends with Laureen Hom's quote, who was older community activist, really important community leader, mentored me, mentored Will, mentored countless other students in the past few decades who were interested in Chinese American community history in Chinatown. And he passed away before, in 2023, before both our books were published, but I know he was so excited to see all this work about LA Chinatown coming out. His quote resonates with me because in the end, I think all of us want to emphasize that among all the conflict, there's still possibilities and opportunities happening in the community. So these are just some examples that are happening right now. So there's the formation of the LA Chinatown Community Land Trust, this intergenerational coalition between the older and younger organizations that actually 10 years ago didn't quite get along or even talk to each other, but now they're coming together to push for this development, this mixed-use development of affordable housing and a cultural center, as well as the reactivation of the Chinatown Teen Council through the Chinatown Library. And they've been really emerging as this really great group of youth who are like young leaders in the community, and they're also linking up with other youth across LA as well too to work on kind of anti-displacement issues. And And so these are all happening now and all at once, showing that there's momentum, right? And an indication that people, and specifically young Asian Americans, still do care about Chinatown. And what I'm seeing also is that they're really striving to do community work that honors the prior generation, but not duplicating them. And instead, we're really trying to learn from them so that they can do better in how they care and steward for the neighborhood, so the next generation can do the same. And with that, that's my book.
Thank you so much, Laureen, for the wonderful presentation and taking time to come up here from San Jose to talk with us. How do you want to sit?
Okay.
Sit. We can why don't we pull our chairs from us? Want to do that?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think we can have Gilbert's quote in the back.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to do it.
So I've got a few questions for Laureen, and then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience to see what you all have to ask. So your book does such a wonderful job, Laureen, of kind of laying out the positions that the various stakeholders have in this issue of gentrification, right? You know, you can tell that all of these folks care very deeply about Chinatown, but they have very, very different takes on it. And I know, you just mentioned that you were embedded in the community for like four years, right? And it's still a little bit too, right? You've been on the board. You eventually joined the board of the CHS, the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. You became very, very active. I'm wondering though, what your book it's not trying to do, which it doesn't do. It doesn't really like lay out your argument of what you think gentrification should work. I mean, you allude to it. I get it. But the point is to like make a strong argument that you feel this is how gentrification should be addressed, right? So as you were going through all of these, working with all of these organizations, interviewing over 50 people, how did you negotiate that? How did you negotiate this kind of space of you as a researcher trying to document their stories, but also I'm sure having very, very committed kind of views on how the community should deal with gentrification?
Yeah, so I think as a researcher, I think this is for all of us, like you kind of go in with a specific approach and a lens, right? Like you can go in saying, this is what I believe in, and it's either going to be proven or disproven based off of what I observed. I didn't go in that way. I came in very much knowing like, okay, there's some ways I'm sort of an insider, but very much an outsider, so I knew some things, but didn't really. So I really came in very much like, okay, I would need to learn and have that kind of perspective. So I came in as my approach to research is, I have some assumptions, but I need to leave it away, like at home, and then go in and talk to a range of people. Because if I'm trying to study and understand a community, I know a community is complex. We talk about communities being internally diverse too, right? So many different, and thinking of the Chinese American community, regional diversity, different immigration, generation, age, all of that, right? And I just wanted to honor that as much as possible. It wasn't easy because I would walk into some of these spaces where I would I really don't agree with you on a personal level, just to be kind of honest. But I think for me it was just like, okay, let me see where they're coming from, right? And that's where it was just really important to understand, okay, you are this type of stakeholder in China, you have this family history. That's why you have that kind of lens to Chinatown that I personally don't have that lens. And I have to respect that, and I have to present that in the book as well too, because this is a book about the community, it's not a book about me.
So I mean, but as I'm sure you did this and you did learn and you it must have changed your own opinions. I'm curious, like, because your book does a wonderful job. I can kind of, as I'm reading through, I can kind of see what the different positions are. I can see why the groups kind of take these positions. Now that you're done with the research, you put the book out there, are you hoping in some ways to kind of at all influence the way in which kind of gentrification takes place in Chinatown, or do you want this more to just be a piece that allows people to kind of see what their different positions are?
I think it's a little bit of both. I hope that the community, and for the most part I've gotten pretty positive feedback too, that they see that, okay, she did right, like even if she included someone I don't get along with in that book, that she accurately kind of reflected my position and my stance on things, and kind of tried to bring it into a cohesive story of what the community is going through. The other kind of aim I had for the book, though, is actually to educate folks who don't know anything about LA Chinatown and Chinatowns, right? Because I think there's a lot of assumptions among especially my field of urban planning and public policy, you know, I mean, I even had this experience in grad school when I said I wanted to do stuff about Asian Americans, where they were like, well, we all know Asian Americans are diverse, what's the big deal? You know, that kind of thing. Different when you're in like Asian American studies or ethnic studies, you don't get that kind of dismissive attitude. So I think there's a lot of assumptions, especially with gentrification, and I don't mean to be like, oh, we're gonna like, to like pit, you know, groups together, but there's recognition of kind of the African American experience, Latinx experience. The Asian American experience is starting to like be a part of that conversation. So from my goal was, let's have this, like hopefully this book and other work too, as part of a larger conversation, can uplift the Asian American experience and not say, oh, it's worse here or anything like that, but just have it be like, what's the relationship going on between these different communities? How are we kind of collectively dealing with this issue? Like, what are the similarities, what are the differences, so that, you know, we can think about how we can address this at a much broader level that impacts all of us.
So I mean, given that, I'm curious, what has been the reception by urban planners, right? You just talked about the people in the community who are appreciative of you being kind of fair to them, but when you kind of, if this is partly for folks outside the community, how have they received it?
I think they've actually been pretty positive to it. I think they're always like, oh, okay, Chinatown, and then they go in, and then when I start going into all these like internal things like, oh, you know, these different like, you know, things like the family and regional associations and the power that they have in the community, and that it's more than just about historic preservation. Because I think that's another thing that a lot of folks tend to think of Chinatown purely as this historic site, and not realizing, no, wait, like, it's more than about historic preservation, it's also like the preservation of affordable housing, the preservation of our community institutions too as well. So I think that has helped to kind of open up their lens to Chinatown a bit. And it's always interesting to be in these, like, the panels with other urban planners who study, again, like other cities and other communities, and just seeing like, oh yeah, you know, kind of going through a similar thing here as well. So let's try to think about this again, like kind of more collectively.
So I'm curious, we're here in San Francisco, Chinatown, you know, we both grew up in San Francisco. Like, for me, when I come back to San Francisco now, I feel like gentrification is very much kind of on steroids. Like the city is gentrifying very, very, very quickly, right? But then when I come to Chinatown, at least, and I'm not a person from, you know, I grew up in the Sunset, I'm not a person that's from Chinatown, but I feel like I don't see the manifestations of gentrification here as clearly as I see them in LA. Like in LA, there's like 4 or 5 like giant condominiums, you know, you've got all of these, you know, mentioned it, like hipster, like new restaurants and things like that, and like, you know, you go away for a year and you come back and you're like, wow, this place is like totally different, right? Whereas I feel like San Francisco, Chinatown, at least outwardly to someone like myself, I don't see those type of changes. Could you talk a little bit about how do you see these two communities? How do you see gentrification affecting San Francisco, Chinatown? Is it affected differently than LA? And if so, what are the reasons?
Yeah, I'm still learning. I'm relearning SF Chinatown now that I moved back, and I'm hesitant to make any claims about what's going on here, given the folks in the room here. But I will say, and this isn't because of the folks who are in the room, the one thing that what you point out about like LA Chinatown being so visible in terms of the gentrification, I think there's kind of 2 things with that. One goes back to just how LA and San Francisco, from an urban planning perspective, are just developed so differently, right? Like San Francisco being this kind of like a smaller city, right? And dense in a lot of ways. LA is sprawled. And then also thinking about, again, all the multiple Chinese American settlements too, right? So I think you can visibly see these changes like much more quickly, or catch on to it in LA. It's low density, right? So for those of you who might be familiar with LA Chinatown and Broadway, where all the businesses are, it's only like 2-story buildings, right? From the planning, if you look at the zoning for it, and you get kind of nerdy here, you can actually build up to about like 6 to 10 stories too. It's actually, you can legally. So that's why it's actually happening now, because I think people are seeing, oh wait, I can make this more dense.
So they didn't have to change the zoning, like those condos, they dwarf everything. Like you go in there and they're massive, right? Like,
they didn't. They actually were within the
interesting.
zoning.
Okay,
That was something that I was surprised. And as a student, I was looking at the zoning and the plan, and Chinatown doesn't have a specific plan for the community too at the very moment.
Right.
It's part of a larger community plan that includes downtown and parts of. Actually, no, not just parts of downtown and the arts district, and so it allowed for some like more like denser buildings too. So I think I had a couple pictures of them there. And some people even say that's not even dense enough because it's only 6 stories. But for most people who are familiar with LA Chinatown and seeing it as this low density, walkable, pedestrian friendly village-like neighborhood, it's so jarring to see that. And they're all and most of them are market rate too as well. The other thing that I think was kind of lacking in Chinatown up until now, with Community Land Trust now being formed, there are many organizations, but LA Chinatown never had one organization that was purely dedicated to community development. So we have the Chinatown Service Center, which is a social service organization. They did partner with Little Tokyo Service Center, which has their own CDC, to develop an affordable housing complex in the late 90s. But there was never an organization like here in San Francisco, Chinatown, the CCDC, Philadelphia has a CDC, other urban Chinatowns also have a community land trust. There just never was an organization that was there in LA Chinatown. And I would argue, you kind of need that as an anchor. So you have really important groups like CCED, the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, SICA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, that do the political advocacy to fight for tenants' rights, to fight for business, long-term business owners' rights to stay in place. But they never got into that whole part of actually trying to control development itself and control land too. And I think that's actually a very important part as well too. And I know there's a lot of negotiation around that, like how does that look like? How do we make sure it's governed by the community equitably and holistically? But I think that never was there in LA Chinatown is also part of why we're sort of seeing what we're seeing in LA Chinatown versus up here in San Francisco.
Yeah, thank you. Just one last question. I'm curious what you think in terms of your book ends in 2018. And I'm curious, when we think about the pandemic as being such a kind of crazy event that affected Asian, had a disproportionate effect definitely on Asian Americans, right? Do you think that the pandemic in Los Angeles had any type of effect on the way in which gentrification, and I know it's after you've done your research, but did it have any effect on the way that gentrification has kind of played itself out in that community?
Yeah, I think it exacerbated a lot of the issues that were already there, right? So it kind of just sped it up, unfortunately. So there are already kind of concerns about certain businesses experiencing a decline, the swap, people not going to the swap meets. That was already happening before the pandemic, but then with the pandemic, that just kind of sped it up and heightened it. So I did mention again that they're kind of in the process of being forcibly displaced and everything, and I think the pandemic kind of led to that as well. So I wouldn't say, again, there was this kind of major event or switch or change that happened. I kind of see it, and goes back to maybe a larger argument when I went over the history of Chinatown, that it's just kind of a part of that larger history of tension and decline and concerns, and trying to respond to the decline too. But I would say that I did see people kind of also come together during the pandemic as well. People were, really trying to get people to go to the businesses and do takeout and just simple things like that, and even doing the delivering groceries to seniors. And so I saw a lot of that kind of organizing happening, which I also think is great. And again, it's another example of how the community will come together. So as much as, again, showing a lot of the things of people not getting along and the conflict, they're always going to come together and try to save their community.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead now and transition to opening it up to the audience. We'll get some questions out there.
I have a loud voice, I can. First off, I just want to thank you very much for the book. I think for me, the concept of sort of putting a framework around Chinatown in the context of power, and maybe even as sort of political centers of gravity or power centers, I think is another framework for our communities to really think about. And I say that because in many ways, I think we think of our communities from certain frameworks that don't necessarily talk to power. They talk about affordability, which is critical. They talk about culture and preservation and history. And I think, they talk about sort of, communities as gateways and immigrant gateways in particular. And I think that's particularly important in a moment where, immigration patterns are changing. And I think there's a question about sort of, at least in my mind, of what are the future of some of our, communities that have been built upon sort of an immigrant gateway kind of concept, and sort of being almost a platform and a receptacle for low-income immigrants to find affordable housing, cultural spaces, food spaces, retail spaces. And I think the notion of power is really powerful because it kind of brings into this, kind of conversation, this notion of community control, but using different tools, and space being one of them. So the question I have, and it's kind of looking forward, and I'm grappling with this because it's happening in San Francisco, but all over. It ties into kind of this conversation around gentrification and displacement, but it seems to me that there's a diametrically opposite framework now that's being really introduced and sort of being framed as sort of the next conversation around equity, which is like this supply side argument around abundance, right? I'm sure you guys have all, the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson book, and in many ways it's starting to really shape and drive kind of the conversation that urban planners are having, planning departments are having. In San Francisco, it's been manifesting itself in different ways. But most recently in some of these conversations around sort of upzoning of the west side in San Francisco, northeast waterfront, and then sort of downtown sort of redevelopment and rethinking downtown as sort of residential. And I think what I'm just trying to sort of get a sense of is, in the academic field, are people thinking about potentially sort of the juxtaposition between these two concepts and, of sort of spatial power and community control from an equity lens versus sort of abundance, which is like almost a one-size-fits-all framework, and how they talk to each other, or don't, because, I think like, having these being diametrically opposed forces are very challenging for communities, but how do we talk to that concept of abundance in ways that are protective or productive for us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't seen that person in terms of trying to merge these kind of different frameworks, right? I've seen it's kind of an economics, a liberal economics perspective of the supply side, right? And so you see a lot of, in the housing, kind of the housing literature, and those who take kind of this more economics perspective, they will argue for the supply side. The other side, which is kind of where I'm at, is that equity lens of how does this kind of reflect the community, right? And like reflect the community needs, because yes, you can kind of build, right, and provide this more supply of housing, right? But if there isn't some, what some would argue, some degree of regulation around that, you can't really ensure that, yes, this is gonna be affordable for people right now too, right? So I think I see that tension happening too, right? It's not just like go and build as much as you want, but that there needs to be still some degree of intervention to make sure that at the current moment that it's affordable for folks too, right? Because what I've seen and what I've heard is that it's kind of this trickle down, right, or ripple effect, that you have the supply side, you build more housing, and then ultimately that will balance out the housing market. But, and I'm not kind of an economics expert, but that's a question of like, well, how many years is that gonna take? How many decades will that take, right? And what incentive do you have for the people who own and develop those properties to not make it higher too, right? So there's that kind of, I see those debates going on. I think in both in practice and in the academic debates too. So, but there are definitely, and this goes back a little bit to like Will's question about, as a researcher you have kind of certain positions too. You can see that among the research on like housing affordability. Some people take the supply side and kind of push for that, and others will be more cautious about it and say, wait, like let's look at how we regulate housing instead.
I just want to build off of what Malcolm was saying. I was struck by, you were saying, who benefits, right? I thought that was really an important way of framing thinking about urban planning. And when I think about Chinatown and our experiences in Chinatown, I was born and raised in Chinatown, still live here, is that with organizations like CCDC, Gordon Lau, which cares for our education, we have the Benevolent Association, and we have parks, all of which is an organic formation where our people, primarily one of the poorest peoples in San Francisco, are able to manage. And look, quality-wise, maybe that's, I mean, we certainly need to up that, but if they're making it. And for some reason, I'm hoping that urban planning is gonna get into this. That urban planning is gonna say, for us to care about a community, we gotta think about who benefits. And it's not the wealthy, right? It's not. It's about, the grandma, it's the grandpas, it's about the other who is like now, who doesn't get food stamps, she's starving.
Yeah.
And so, where are we going with urban planning?
Yeah, and I also want to point out, also urban planners, they're all over the place. Like,
Yeah.
they kind of work in all these different places. Like they can work in the city, which I think is when they have the most influence, right? So we can think of like the people who do city planning and really making sure that they have that sensitivity and that lens in terms of how they do their work too as well. And I think that means they need to have better relationships and partnerships with local communities. But then we also have urban planners who work at places like CCDC, right? And I think that they also have that kind of lens already to their work, so it's almost like a natural environment for them to be. But I think you are speaking to these folks who are getting, whether it's a PhD in urban planning or a master's in urban planning or just want to go into that field, to be in these different spaces where they can have that influence and say like, hey, listen, let's do better methods of making sure that the community is involved in the planning for their neighborhoods too. So, but yeah, and going back to that question of who benefits, kind of bringing back kind of my personal experience too. I think that was also what I was grappling with too, because like I care about Chinatown, both San Francisco, LA. I never lived here personally. My mom and my dad, they lived here, right? I never lived here, and so I could have all these opinions and be like, no, this shouldn't happen, and this is what I care about, but I'm like, but should I actually be prioritized, right? Like, I want to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable, right, who really rely on Chinatown as their home, the place where they work, the services that they receive, that they're prior, not like mine necessarily, like the sentimental attachments that I had to. So I was also kind of grappling with that, and I think it comes out at times kind of subtly in the book too as well.
We have time for a few more questions. If the questions up there.
I'd be loud too. I'm thinking about this ethnic settlements like Chinatown. It's because they're all fueled by immigrants. But with the new trend, as Malcolm said, immigrants are different now. So the extreme case is like Japantown. And then the proximate case is like Little Italy in San Francisco. What do you see, like if like San Francisco, Chinatown, to the extreme case becomes Japantown, like a museum, like a place to eat, but no real people is living here in I don't know how many decades, but Chinese immigrants like myself, I don't live in Chinatown.
Right.
I don't have a real connection to Chinatown, except I eat here. So how do you seeing like this gentrification? It could be a need for the new immigrants. I don't know, I'm just posing the question for you.
Right. Yeah, I think you're getting into these larger questions about like Chinatown, or raising the point of Chinatown's identity broadly as this immigrant gateway too, right? And more recently, at some point it was kind of an immigrant gateway for Chinese Americans specifically, across different kind of socioeconomic and class groups, right, because of racial segregation. So Chinese Americans couldn't necessarily, even if they had maybe the means, they couldn't necessarily live outside of China. That's kind of the earlier history of it. But now we're kind of seeing that Chinatown very much, at least it's kind of more contemporary identity, in terms of residentially, I mean, the workforce is primarily kind of low-income, kind of working class residents too, right? So I think for me, in terms of thinking about, again, this preservation and the future of Chinatown, there's kind of two things we have to work on. One is the cultural preservation of the larger Chinese American history and the heritage, right? That's one aspect of preservation. And the other aspect of preservation is keeping Chinatown what I say is a pretty core identity, which is a place where working class immigrants could come and live here. And have a choice to leave, right? I think that's also a key thing about also forced displacement. They can't live here anymore because it's unaffordable, right? They just don't have, they can't keep up with the rent too. And that shouldn't really be happening in Chinatown or anywhere really, right? So trying to maintain also that core purpose and identity of Chinatown is this kind of space for working class Asian immigrants to improve their lives and say, I want to stay here or I want to leave. I think that also needs to be part of the preservation of Chinatown. I know it's like kind of a broad vision, but I think that's an important vision statement to have for SF Chinatown, LA Chinatown, all the urban Chinatowns in North America.
Maybe one or two more questions if we have them.
Yeah, so I was wondering because I remember you mentioned something about like when you were talking to people that a lot of them would often emphasize like their material connections to Chinatown, whether it was like that they lived here or that they owned property in Chinatown as being like legitimizing either their claim to speak on behalf of Chinatown or to delegitimize others' claim. So like I was wondering if like in the process of doing all your interviews, if you had like spoken to people who either like didn't like live in Chinatown or who didn't like own property, and if so, like how they kind of explained like how they saw their like ties to Chinatown and their stake in Chinatown, and if there were any like themes or like interesting things that came up in terms of how they explained their I guess their stake in caring about Chinatown, and whether they like ran into challenges with justifying that to other community members in their organizing.
Yeah, I'd say a majority of the people I spoke to did not live in Chinatown at the time that I was doing the field work, and then also never really did, ever. So they were just kind of activated, had again those kind of activated to be engaged in the community, because Chinatown again had all these organizations that people could be a part of, or just had kind of those kind of family, claims that I mentioned, like, oh, my grandparents lived here and they wanted to be involved. And so I saw kind of two things happening, which again, I go into more detail in that chapter where I go over the community organizations. I saw some people kind of who are like members of some of these organizations, again, not residents or business owners or property owners, actually saying, I can't speak on behalf, and they actually just completely disengaged from talking and addressing gentrification for the community. And I would, over time, was like, okay, that makes sense. And then the more I was involved with the community and got to know them, I actually kind of felt like that probably isn't like the best approach either, right? Because you actually have kind of an opportunity to, because you have the relationships outside of the community, you have kind of also the language ability, the knowledge and everything, to actually say something and to kind of to do something protective of the community too. So I saw that happening. And then the other kind of other response that I also saw was that people were acknowledged it. They said, yeah, I'm not a resident here. I have these kind of maybe weak family ties, but I'm trying. I am trying to learn about the community. I'm creating activities, events, and these spaces where it's trying to bridge both the people who are getting politically engaged in Chinatown and the residents and the workers and the business owners in Chinatown too. It wasn't easy, and I think it was like sometimes it didn't always work out, but I think even when it didn't work out, they still tried too. And I think that's sort of the key thing, is that it sounds very like very happy, but think of the fact that people were just really motivated and cared and just kept trying even when it didn't really work out the way they wanted it to. That was their way of kind of doing community work and just building those relationships and exchanging knowledge with each other as well too. So I saw that actively happening as well. So I think, I think it's very easy to, and I saw that because, and I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but when I started the research, there was actually a Walmart that was going to be built, or that was actually there in Chinatown. It's now gone. It was only there for a couple of years. But that's what heightened all this like conflict about who's the stakeholder, because a lot of the people who were the anti-Walmart in Chinatown were young Asian Americans who didn't live in the neighborhood and labor activists too. And so they were just saying things like, this isn't good for the community, and then people were saying, well, how do you know that? You're not from the community. So, but through that, in their work of kind of pushing back against the Walmart, they got to know the Chinatown community, and they're still there right now, building really strong relationships with them.
Maybe last question out there?
Hi, my name is Ted Dang. I'm on the board of EVALSI, East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, on the brighter side of the Bay. 50 years ago, I was a student at Berkeley, and we were motivated by Asian studies courses in the civil rights movement to be more active in our community. And we formed this corporation that today manages about 3,000 residential units and half $500 million worth of real estate. 50 years ago, there was nothing known as community development. Today, you have programs at the university that train people to do that. And we have people like Lauren, who are professors, who are studying the issue. So the whole industry has advanced tremendously. But Chinatowns are always going to evolve. Some will improve, some will change for the worse, but they will always be around. I appreciate this type of research that can hopefully identify continuing problems in our communities and perhaps suggest more solutions. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So let's go ahead and thank Professor Hom for their comments today. She will be available afterwards to sign books, so I know some of you bought books in advance, and I believe we have some books here for sale if you haven't bought a book already, so she'll be up here signing books. You're welcome to come up and chat with her and meet her.
And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
So thank you again for coming, hang around. We have refreshments right in this hallway here. Feel free to go upstairs, take a look. And Dr. Laureen, Dr. Will, come ask me questions. And thank you again for coming. You did. You're welcome. You did.